Just think about it. 50 years ago, 4 out of 5 Chinese worked in the fields, and 96% of Chinese live below the poverty line. And today, China produces almost a third of all goods on the planet, starts trade wars, and participates in the space race with Russia and the United States. And all this under the rule of the Communist Party and the absence of broad democracy. How has China managed to overtake those who, it seemed, were simply impossible to catch up with in the last 30 years? Let's dive into the unique story of how the oldest of the living empires is winning back its dominion. In 1976, the great helmsman of China, Mao Zedong, dies. The leader of the political elite of China becomes Deng Xiaoping, a man who, together with Mao, went the way from revolution and civil war to the party elite. But unlike his boss, Xiaoping did not divide reforms into bad market and good socialist ones. He spoke figuratively like this: "It does not matter whether a cat is black or a white cat. If it catches mice, it is a good cat." In December 1978, the next plenum of the Central Committee of the Communist Party was held, at which Deng Xiaoping proclaimed a new course. From now on, blind adherence to the precepts of Mao and the ideological dogmas of Marxism ceased, and the green light was given to any rational ideas and proposals. In practice, it worked like this. While Xiaoping was planning his reforms in a small village in Anhui province, the peasants secretly agreed to divide the land of the collective farm among themselves and work only on their own plot, fulfill the state harvest quota, and keep the surplus for themselves. Well, it seems rational, but do you smell it? This is the breath of capitalism. How is that? Each? Yes, with his own, not the common one. In the very first year of the improvised experiment, this village showed an increase in crop yields and, of course, attracted the attention of higher authorities. But instead of repression, as it might have been under Mao, the party highly appreciated the successes of the village, and in September 1979, extended this system to other provinces of China. If the peasants fulfilled the established quota, then they could officially keep the surplus harvest for themselves and do with it whatever they wanted, including selling it. Thanks to this incentive system, agricultural productivity in China increased more than 1.5 times over the next 5 years. By 1984, collective farms in China had almost completely disappeared, and most of the land was transferred for use to individual families. No, the land, of course, did not become private, but it was simply transferred to people for rent. By the way, in China even today, individuals cannot own land, but can only rent it from the state for decades. In general, with the arrival of Xiaoping, the Communist Party of China began to introduce market elements into the planned economy and build socialism with Chinese characteristics. The sharp increase in agricultural efficiency led to the fact that about half of the peasants were left without work. However, if earlier people were tied to their collective farms, now they could look for any job. Moreover, the party even allowed small businesses, and therefore the streets of Chinese cities were filled with small shops, hairdressers, and beauty salons. Against this background, the contribution of private business to the economy began to grow rapidly. And 20 years after the start of the reforms, it overtook the contribution of state enterprises. And this in a planned economy with a strong role for the Communist Party. However, after the first market reforms of Xiaoping, China still remained a backward country compared to the countries of Western Europe, the United States, and Japan. And in order to catch up with the leaders, it was necessary to see what technologies could be borrowed from them. In the spring of 1978, a plane with high-ranking members of the party flies out of China for a trip to the developed countries of Europe and Southeast Asia. In essence, this trip was the Chinese version of the Iwakura mission, carried out by Japanese officials 100 years ago to study the experience of foreign powers. Deng Xiaoping himself also went on a diplomatic tour to improve relations with neighbors in Western countries. And of course, this could look like betrayal in the eyes of the neighboring Soviet Union. But there was nothing surprising about this. After World War II, China and the Soviet Union were united by the friendship between Mao and Stalin. But after the death of the Soviet leader, Khrushchev came to power, who began to debunk the cult of Stalin.
Или партия открыто, по-ленински смело осудить порожденные в период культа личности Сталина ошибки и извращения.
And Mao, who considered Stalin his teacher, could not tolerate this, and relations between the countries deteriorated. In 1969, this tension even led to an armed clash on the border between the countries. In general, by the end of the 70s, only memories remained of the friendship between the Soviet Union and China. And when Deng Xiaoping began to carry out market economic reforms, there was no place for him in Moscow at all in the Chinese leader's travel list. Moreover, looking at the stagnation in the economy and politics that occurred in the Soviet Union in the 70s, China drew its own conclusions. Firstly, in 1982, China adopted a new constitution, which limited the possibility of one person staying in a government post to 2 terms of 5 years. All this was done to ensure that there was a change of power in the party and a renewal of personnel. Secondly, Xiaoping weakened the power of the center so that the provinces would pay Beijing only a fixed portion of their income and keep the rest for themselves. And there, this money was distributed as needed and directed to the necessary projects. And the money was not stolen, because career advancement in the party directly depended on how well you did in your province and how actively it grew economically. In fact, the current head of China, Xi Jinping, came to power through this mechanism. He achieved good results in Zhejiang province, got higher in the party leadership, and won the political struggle there. Well, since relations between China and the Soviet Union had cooled so much, the United States quickly took on the role of a friend of the Celestial Empire. In 1972, U.S. President Nixon came to Shanghai and took a photo on the Great Wall of China. China began sending its doctors and scientists to the United States for study and training, and American engineers visited China as consultants. This gradual cooperation led to the fact that in 1979, Washington recognized the existence of a united China, of which Taiwan is a part. No, of course, the states were not going to give up their claims to the island, where the opponents of the Chinese communists once fled. And so the United States concluded a separate treaty with Taiwan, according to which they maintained trade and unofficial ties with the island. Well, China laid claim to American money and technology, which it needed so much. And of course, Taiwan was not the only disputed territory of China. In fact, Hong Kong also remained British territory. In 1842, when China lost the First Opium War, I remind you, Hong Kong was transferred to Great Britain, and in 1897, the Crown leased it for 99 years. That is why in 1984, Deng Xiaoping met with the British Prime Minister, the Iron Lady Margaret Thatcher, to decide what we would do with Hong Kong. On the one hand, it was to return to the unconditional possession of China. But over the years of British influence, Hong Kong had become a global financial center with values different from those of mainland China. The Iron Lady was for preserving the capitalist system built in Hong Kong, and the Europeanized Chinese would certainly not have merged so abruptly into the new reality. That is why England was concerned about the protection and freedom of these companies. Deng Xiaoping insisted that Hong Kong become an integral part of Chinese culture. Well, okay, maybe with some concessions. In the end, they agreed on the following. Britain still gives Hong Kong to China in 1997, as stipulated by the treaty. But for 50 years, an independent financial and judicial system based on British law has been preserved there, as well as autonomy in all areas except defense and foreign policy. In general, this is one country and two systems, and the former British colony turned out to be incredibly valuable for the Chinese economy. Almost 60% of Chinese foreign direct investment goes through Hong Kong. However, in order for the economy to depend not only on Hong Kong, China opened special economic zones on the coast. These are territories where foreign companies are subject to preferential taxes and are exempt from duties. So in 1980, 4 free economic zones were created. Xiamen, Shantou, Zhuhai, and Shenzhen. And it seems that there is nothing special in this practice, because similar zones exist all over the world. But China outplayed them all due to one factor: the prices of its labor force. You just take the country with the largest population on the planet, which is very poor at the same time, and you will get an ideal labor market for any foreign company. And if you look at the salaries of workers in Southeast Asia in the 80s, you will see that, in fact, the cheapest labor force was in China. The provinces that China declared free economic zones began to grow at an incredible rate. For example, if in 1979 the GDP of the same Shenzhen was 196 million yuan, then in 2019 it was more than 2.5 million. Trillions of yuan. The secret of this growth lies not only in the openness of the economy, but also in the political structure of China, which was laid down by Deng Xiaoping. The whole country turned into a huge competitive market, where every official was looking for a way to bring his province to the top. Well, foreign investment paid for this whole banquet. But despite all this, China has not become a democracy, and the party has not turned into a liberal government. That is why, if you pick up a yuan of any denomination, you will see a portrait of Mao there, not Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping did not debunk the cult of Mao, as Khrushchev did with the cult of Stalin. The great helmsman was and remains a national symbol, and there is logic in this. After all, if you, as Mao's successor, criticize him, then you will undermine the power of the entire party. You can criticize and change China in everything except four things: the socialist path, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the leading role of the communist, and that same socialism with Chinese characteristics gave rise to interesting contradictions. Because enterprises were allowed to sell excess production on the market, a dual pricing system emerged in the economy. The state bought goods from enterprises at planned prices, and ordinary citizens bought the same goods, but at market prices. And such a dual pricing system accelerated inflation. In 1988, it reached 19%, and in 1994, 24%. Of course, people went on strike against such consequences of the reforms. The most famous case occurred in Tiananmen Square in 1989. You may have seen a photo of a man stopping a whole column of tanks. It happened exactly in Tiananmen Square, where the Chinese government sent troops to suppress the riot, and the official statistics suffered that there were no bandits or complainants in that event, and any mention of it is prohibited in China. Coincidence or not, but during these events, Deng Xiaoping left big politics and resigned from his official post by his own decision, handing over the reins of power to the younger generation. In 1992, he went on a tour of the south of the country to personally meet with local officials and explain to them the importance of the reforms carried out. All so that, after his departure, the country would not return to the conservative path of government, but would continue the policy of openness and careful market reforms. How important and successful this trip was, you can judge by the dynamics of foreign direct investment in China after 1992. But even though Deng Xiaoping laid the foundations of modern Chinese economic power, we cannot end our story there. After all, the way China became the world's first economy, flooded the entire planet with its goods, and became the main competitor for the United States, deserves special attention.